to us. And when He does it in His ways. We may have different ideas, different ways. We may think these are better than what God is doing. But God always does His way. Because if He followed our ways, then we may boast. We may boast in that we saved us. But God chose the opposite, and He does it in His ways, so that He want to tell us. He tells us that it is not you who won the battle, it is not you who won victory, but it is me. That's why today's sermon title is God's salvation and God's ways. I don't know if you are familiar with Chinese missions history. There was a man named James Hudson Taylor who was the first Protestant missionary to go inside and minister in China. What I mean by inside, before him, all the Western missionaries were stayed on East Coast land, surrounded by Shanghai. Because they felt the inland was dangerous, they could not preach the gospel in inland. But this guy, James Hudson Taylor, brought this gospel inside the continent. He was born in 1832 in a small village in England. From an early age, he had a call from God to bring the gospel to China. At that time, China was mostly unreached, and the inland was considered very dangerous for Western missionaries. But when Hudson Taylor arrived in China, he decided to go to the people and preach the gospel to them directly. So he went inside the continent, and instead of wearing Western clothes, he dressed in traditional Chinese clothing and cut his hair in a Chinese hairstyle to go among them. And he learned their culture and language. Because he believed that God could do great things through ordinary people like him. The challenge was that at time, most missionaries did not believe going inland. And they thought Hudson Taylor's way was not effective. But he believed that if the gospel is to reach people, it must go into their lives. God used his dedication to bear amazing fruit. So Hudson Taylor and his small group did this, followed God, and God used them to bear much fruit. The mission organization he founded was the China Inland Mission because they were going inland. The organization grew and grew, sending hundreds of missionaries to different parts of China, and the gospel spread to many regions through it. So through his life, and this small group, God showed us the truth that when the weak and small ones obey in God, God can do great things. It's not the numbers, it's not the wisdom of the human, it's not the tradition, but when we fully obey God, even though His way doesn't seem to make sense from our perspective, then He works through His ways. The same is true of the passage we read today, the story of Gideon's 300 men. God accomplished great victories through seemingly ordinary or sometimes inadequate people. God's ways may be different from what we imagine. God's way may be different from our ways, but He always provides and accomplishes everything we need. So this famous story of Gideon's 300 men is a great example of how God works out His plan of salvation in His ways. So during the time when Gideon was a judge, so Judge was a leader. He was not only a religious leader, but a political and military leader before the Israelites had kings. So Gideon was their military and political and religious leader, and he ruled as a judge. At that time, the Israelites were under great suffering from the Midianites. So I don't know if you know the term Midians, familiar. But this whole group of people is actually a distant relative of the Israelites. A lot of group of people around the promised land, they were the descendants of Abraham. Like Edom and Midian and Moab, Ammon, every group of people. Abraham's third wife, Keturah, gave birth to sons, and fourth of whom is Midian. His name was Midian, Abraham's son. And then about 600 years later, when Gideon was judging the Israelites, the descendants of Midian had been living near the land of Canaan for generations, through 600 years. And as the Israelites began to conquer and live in Canaan, the Midianites invaded and harassed the Israelites because they were living very close by. So when the Midianites' invasions became too much to bear, Gideon called for a fight against them, and 32,000 people gathered around him immediately. So 32,000 men around him. But with such a large army, God only left 300 men out of 32,000. And with those 300, God gave them an incredible victory. And why did God do that? Why did God choose only 300 men? Today we're going to look at Gideon's story to see how God accomplishes his salvation. First, God's salvation is not dependent on human ability. God's salvation is not dependent on your ability. In the story of Gideon, God leaves only 300 men behind to defeat a great enemy with only a small number of men. And this tells us that our ultimate salvation and our victory is not by our own strength or numbers, but by God's power. Go to New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." So it is clear that God used these weak and lowly and foolish things to reveal him, for making not to boast. God wanted to reveal himself through this situation by using the weak, using the lowly, and using the foolish. And also in Gideon's story, when God first reduced the army of 32,000 to about 10,000, he said, "You have too many people." Reason was clear. You have too many people. And if you are victorious, you may become arrogant. That was the reason when God reduced them into a third. It is true, all of Israel's battles, from coming out of Egypt to the conquest of Canaan, all their history are victories with God on their side. When God was not on their side, they lost the battle. But when God was their side, they won the battle. And in every one of those battles, God made it clear who was in charge. God's purpose was clear. He wanted to show who was in charge. Think about the Battle of Jericho. When God commanded the Israelites to circle the city of Jericho once a day, and 7 times on the last day, what he was intending was to see who would take the wall down. He wanted to show who will take the wall down. Circling around the city doesn't do anything. They didn't throw any stone. They didn't throw any spear to the wall. But the wall fell down. And in the Exodus too, they did not do anything to part the water. But water was parted. And the water didn't touch their feet. They didn't even fight back to stop the Egyptian army that was chasing them. Every step of the way, God led them and gave them victory. The reason God works in this way, not using human power, not relying on numbers, is that in this way only can we not be arrogant. In this way only can we not rely on human power. So because that is the only way we not be arrogant, we not relying on ourselves, that is why God used a small number to demonstrate it is He who is in control. So God reduced the size of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 10,000 and ultimately to 300. Just as God reduced the size of Gideon's army, God does not rely on our qualification and our abilities when He gives us a victory. Rather, He sometimes makes us weaker so that His grace and power can be revealed. So when you feel like you became weak, when you feel like you became foolish, then you have to understand the situation is God is using so that His power and His grace may be revealed. So instead of complaining, instead of grumbling, we have to be thankful that God gives us this opportunity. There may be times when we need to do this thing right now, but we get into trouble. We're out of money. We have broken relationships. Where knowledge and situation gets worse and worse. Then we grumble to God that Him taking away what we need right now at this moment. And we ask, why has God forsaken me? Or why is He leading me through the wilderness when it happens to us? However, we must know that is when we need to recognize that God is preparing us to reveal His power. I know it is easy to read Gideon's story and praise God. And it is easy to read Gideon's story and say, oh, God is preparing him when God reduces the number. But it's so hard when it happens to us. It is so hard to acknowledge Him when God takes away the thing that you need right now. But when God reduced our army into a third or even 100, then when we read we need to read the situation with faith. We need to put ourselves into Gideon's situation. God worked through weakness. God worked through foolishness. So this victory in weakness is connected to the salvation that Jesus accomplished on the cross. Jesus opened the way to salvation not through strength, not through power, but through humility and sacrifice. Because God's salvation and victory are not dependent on human ability. And second, God uses a small number of people to fulfill His salvation plan. When Gideon's army was reduced from 32,000 to 10,000 and finally to 300, from human perspective, it seemed unlikely that they would ever win this war. But God used those few 300 men to defeat the mighty Midianite army. And we need to know who these 300 men were. Why did God choose them? If you read the passage of God reducing the number and selecting 300, the criteria was clear. The criteria was bold but not reckless. Bold but not reckless. The criteria for 10,000 men was boldness. When Gideon first called out and drew a large number of people, many of them were still in the state of fear. They were called out, but they were still afraid of Midianite army. Because they may have come because of their friends. They may have been picked out of their families. Or maybe they started out bold, but when they saw the numbers of the Midianites, they became to fear. The Midianites' number was so great. So in verse 9, God told Gideon, if you are afraid, go to the camp of the Midianites tonight. And Gideon went out. Means even the leader of this group were afraid. Gideon was afraid and went out. And what he saw in the Midianites camp was the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. So perhaps their numbers and size made Israelites fearful. But you cannot go to war with people who are afraid. That's why there's only 10,000 left who were bold and brave to fight the war. But the problem is, with these 10,000 bold men, God still says there's still too many. Take them to the river. And God ordered Gideon to separate two groups. Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. Simply because of the word kneel down, we mistakenly think that those who knelt down were the chosen ones. But it was the other way. Those who lapped the water with their tongues, with the cups hands, they were the ones who were chosen. And Gideon sent those who knelt down and drank. So these people who went home were among the 10,000 who were bold, but perhaps they were not vigilant. Those who drank the water like dog lapped the water was the ones who were vigilant and pay attention to the situation around them. But those who just knelt down and drank the water was just reckless, insensitivity, and careless. So these people who went home were maybe bold, but were reckless, groundless boldness. There are those who say, I am bold and I am fearless. God will give me victory. What could possibly happen to me? They may sound bold and they may sound with good faith, but in reality, they don't know what is going on in their lives. They're just bold but reckless. They may say, don't worry, God will take care of everything, but they do not know life difficulty. In life, we have all seen people who say, I've dedicated my life to God, I have committed to God, and very soon give up and turn away when life's difficulties hit them. So unfortunately, their words are bold but reckless. So God turned the people who were bold but reckless go home. God chose the people who were bold but with knowledge, bold but careful, bold but paying attention. They were realistic enough to recognize the seriousness of their situation, even as they were quenching their thirst. But they were still bold enough to trust God in the war. Therefore, God's criteria for the final 300 was a combination of boldness and vigilance. We need to be like this minority who were bold but vigilant. We don't want to be bold and reckless. It is through these few people that God accomplishes great things. God is not limited by numbers or size. And He accomplishes great things through a small group who follow His will. And Jesus too. Even Jesus chose only 12 to spread the gospel. And it was those few people who revealed the power of the gospel to change the world. Like Gideon's 300 men, God's call to us now is not to size or strength, but of faith and obedience and boldness with vigilance. 3, God's salvation is entirely dependent on God. God's salvation is entirely dependent on God. The way Gideon's 300 men defeated Midian was entirely through God's way. We may have our own ideas to win the war. We may have our own know-hows and knowledge to get out of this difficult situation. But when God works, when God accomplishes, He uses His own ways because salvation is completely dependent on God. Look at the story of Gideon. Basically, the idea of giving up numbers in war is completely contrary to human wisdom. It is contrary to the human wisdom. And even more, when Gideon took the remaining 300 men to fight the war, he did so with just jars and torches. The story teaches us that the way of salvation is not dependent on human method or strategies, but is completely dependent on God. Ephesians chapter 2 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Gideon's victory was not dependent on human strategy, weapons, or numbers, but on the power of God. Similarly, our salvation is a gift from God, not something we can earn or do. Gideon's story makes it clear that God's salvation is something that He accomplishes His own way and gives us as a gift. And finally, Gideon's 300 men, the story is a representation of Jesus Christ, our Savior, the one who gives us victory. It is not just another Old Testament war story. Like almost all of the Old Testament story, this story of victory is a foreshadowing of the work of Jesus to come. This is how Jesus accomplished His victory. As Gideon saved Israel through 300 men, Jesus did the same for the world through the weakness of the cross and the small group of 12 people, most of whom betrayed and fled their teacher. Jesus did not choose the large numbers or the strong. It was not because Jesus only had weak people around Him. Jesus had rich people around Him. Joseph Arimathea was a rich person. Jesus had powerful person around Him. Nicodemus was a member of Sanhedrin. And Jesus was acknowledged by Roman soldier Pilate. And he had all these strong and powerful and rich people around them. But He did not choose them, but He chose the small and weak people around Him. 12 men who betrayed Him, mostly unqualified men. So Jesus sought out the poor and marginalized, and He cared for them with love. And He gave His life to save them. By dying on the cross, Jesus opened the way for us to be saved. Just as Gideon's small army defeated the great army of Midian, the power of sin and death was broken through the cross and resurrection of Jesus. Then from this story, in our lives, we must look to God for salvation. It's coming from God. And we must not focus on our small numbers and small abilities. And we must remember that the victory of our lives is completely dependent on God. The missionary I referred in the beginning, Hudson Taylor, he once said, "God is not looking for men of great faith. God is not looking for men of great faith, but He is looking for common men to trust His great faithfulness." Common men to trust His great faithfulness. Because it is not through our faith that we won the victory, but it is power of God that we win the victory. The story of Gideon's 300 men teaches us that our faith should be in God alone, not even our faith. Not relying on our numbers or abilities, but trusting in God's way. That is true faith that God requires. Matthew 17 says, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move." What moves the mountain is not our faith, because the size of our faith doesn't matter. But it is God's power to move the mountain. Our job is to rely on Him. We don't have to be special men. We can be common men. We can be just ordinary people. But when we have faith in God, and God will do great things, as He did through Gideon's 300 men. So I want you to look at your situation. If God has reduced your army from 32,000 to 300, that is when God starts working. It's not disaster. It's not a tragic thing to happen, but it is God working inside you. Because He wants to reveal Himself, His power through you. So take it with thanksgiving and wait patiently that God works through you, because God can do some great things through your small faith. If you rely on Him and depend on Him fully. Let us pray. When you pray, pray for